All right. Thank you all, everyone, for joining us today. I'm Jordan Money, the Director of Events and Communications at the Center for Security Studies and Studies Program. And before I introduce today's speaker, I have just a few quick notes for you. First, you should have been automatically muted when you joined Zoom. Please go ahead and stay on mute unless you are asking a question. You all, I think, know the drill at this point about avoiding background noise on Zoom. We have a small group today, so during the Q&A portion, we really encourage you to turn your speaker on so that our speaker, or your camera on rather, so that our speaker can engage a little bit more with you all and have a discussion, but you are welcome to leave it off if you prefer. I know some of you may be squeezing in lunch and so forth, so feel free to either bring your lunch on camera or keep your camera off. We will have plenty of time for Q&A later on. When we get there, you will be able to use the raise hand function, or you can put your question in the chat and I'll ask it out loud. Please do hold on to your questions until that point so that our presenter can get through her presentation initially. And finally, you will notice that this session is being recorded so that folks can watch it later on. Please do keep that in mind. Anything you say out loud will be recorded, as will your video if you choose to turn it on while you are speaking. With all of that said, I'd like to introduce Jessica Duque, who is the Outreach and Development Officer at the Institute for Economics and Peace, which means that she manages engagement and education efforts conducted in the Americas for IEP. IEP is an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank dedicated to shifting the world's focus to peace as a positive, achievable, and tangible measure of human well-being and progress. And they work with a wide range of partners internationally as well as domestically, and collaborate with various international organizations to measure and communicate the economic value of peace, and in this instance, to measure the impact of terrorism on the world. So I will turn it over to Jessica to discuss the 2020 GTI.
Thanks so much, Jordan. Hello, everyone. Feel free, if you're able, to take some time to introduce yourself in the chat. I'd love to know what program you're in, maybe something about your background, or if you're also working full-time or part-time, what organizations you're affiliated with, just so I can get an idea of who's in the audience today. But as Jordan mentioned, today I'll be sharing research from one of our major reports, the Global Terrorism Index. So within the report, we cover key trends in terrorism and rank countries most impacted by terrorism, which includes the Islamic State, its affiliates, as well as far-right terrorism. We also calculate the economic impact and take a look at the systems in which terrorist groups are able to gain influence. So this report was released in about November 2020. And so the specific year results during that period of research takes a look at 2019 up until about spring 2020. As Jordan mentioned, any questions that you feel come up, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we can also discuss them in Q&A. So the GTI is in its 8th edition. It ranks 163 countries on how impacted by terrorism they've been in the past year. That's able to cover about 99.7% of the world's population. We source data on terrorist incidents from the START database, which is produced by the University of Maryland. Some of you may be familiar with that. A bit of background on the methodology. So when we produce the GTI, we define terrorism as the use of illegal force and violence by a non-state actor to attain political, economic, religious, or social goals through fear, coercion, or intimidation. So that's the definition that we go by. We recognize that terrorism not only produces a physical impact, but also a psychological one. And that's something we try to reflect in this report. So a bit of background on the methodology. Using the START database, we grab 4 indicators. First, the total number of terrorist incidents in a given year. Second, the number of fatalities. Third, the number of injuries. And fourth, the weight of property damage. So those are weighted according to impact. We also weigh in terms of a 5-year impact to account for the after effects that a terrorist attack would have on society 1 to 4 years after it occurs, because we recognize that a terrorist attack has effects well beyond just the year that it's carried out. So those scores are weighted, and that's how we rank our countries up against one another. And then in terms of socioeconomic indicators, we use those to take a closer look at systems and the factors that might strongly correlate to terrorism, such as internal conflict, corruption, military expenditure, etc. So this year's results. A quick world map of where we see the impact of terrorism and the regions most affected. So the countries in green, they're about 33. That means they haven't had a terrorist attack in about 5 years. So big takeaways from this year's report is that one, terrorism continues to fall after the military defeat of ISIL in 2014. Terrorism is spreading in different areas and is starting to take different forms. We'll talk about how it's spread in sub-Saharan Africa. And then third, right-wing terrorism is increasing in the West. So this map is actually on our website, and you can hover over each country to see the country level data if you'd like to use it. So here are the top 10 countries most impacted by terrorism. These countries probably come as no surprise. These are the same countries in last year's Global Terrorism Index, except as you can see, there are some changes in ranks. So in each of these countries, with the exception of the DRC and Yemen, there's been an improvement in score, actually. One thing to note is that all of these countries are involved in at least one active conflict. They differ in terms of conflict. For example, Afghanistan, Nigeria, Syria, Somalia, and Yemen are all classified as being in a state of war. And the rest of the countries on this list are involved in multiple minor conflicts. This is important to know because, as we know, if we want to better understand terrorism, we should also be aware of its links to conflict as a whole. So as I mentioned before, terrorism has been on a downward trend since its peak in 2014. And so between 2018 and 2019, deaths from terrorism decreased about 15%. But coupling that is the alarming increase, as I mentioned, in specific areas. For example, if you look at Burkina Faso, in 2018, they had 86 casualties, but in 2019 had around 600 for terrorism. So that's quite a big increase. Other trends that we can see from this chart, Afghanistan continues to amount for the majority of deaths, about 41% of deaths. And so here is the economic impact of terrorism in 2019. The global economic impact of terrorism was estimated to be about $26.4 billion. We actually measured that in the purchasing power parity. This is actually 25% less than in 2018 and continues to decline. So for context, in 2014, at the peak of Islamic State activity, the economic impact of terrorism was about 116 billion. So how do we calculate this? The total cost includes both the direct and indirect costs associated with death, injury, and property damage during a terrorist incident. And so with the direct costs, we also take into account the expenditures incurred by the victim, perpetrator, and the government. And then with the indirect costs, we take into account the costs that would be associated with physical or psychological trauma, as well as the loss of future income. What this doesn't take into account, however, is the direct/indirect costs on the economy. So it doesn't take into account investments that would come from like counterterrorism programs or CVE programs. So I'd say that this is a rather conservative model. One of the things that IEP does as an institute is we calculate the economic cost of conflict and violence more broadly. So that's a report that we have in and of itself that also includes this measure. So here you can see really when terrorism had peaked in 2014, mainly due to ISIL activity and the Syrian civil war. But you can see proportionally that even though there's an overall decrease in fatalities after 2014, the number of deaths that occur within a specific country shifted from mainly being in Iraq and Afghanistan to now to now shifting to the rest of the world, moving on into Africa. And then just at the top, you see Europe and North America. Even though these are areas in which terrorism still receives high amounts of media coverage, proportionately, they reflect a small percentage of deaths overall. The report also looks at the top 4 terrorist groups responsible for the most fatalities in 2019. So those were the Taliban, Boko Haram, ISIL, and Al-Shabaab. So previously, when I've given this presentation, I've gotten questions about how we determine groups that are responsible for the most deaths. For example, whether or not we take into consideration regional affiliates or groups that might work in partnership with the groups in the chart. But in this chart, we stick to core groups and do not include affiliates. But in the GTD, you could see those affiliates and how they're ranked as well. These are deaths from terrorism by conflict type. As I mentioned, a majority of terrorism occurs within a conflict situation. So as you can see here, deaths from terrorism that occur in a war, in minor armed conflict, and also in non-conflict situations. So how do we categorize that? We define a minor armed conflict situation as having 25 to 1,000 battle deaths in a given year. And then a war is something we would consider having over 1,000 deaths in a single year. And for non-conflict, that's where we see less than 600 deaths. And so most recently, the most deaths have occurred in minor armed conflict situations. What we're seeing is this sort of medium intensity conflict, in which terrorism is occurring, but hasn't yet erupted into full-blown war. So we see globally multiple of these medium intensity conflicts happening around. And so looking at trends by region, we can see that 5 years ago, the majority of deaths occurred in the MENA region, but now they occur mostly in South Asia. If you look at 2019, that uptick of deaths in South Asia surpassing that of the MENA region, and then also deaths in sub-Saharan Africa also surpassing those in the MENA region. To put this in perspective, as I mentioned, they happen predominantly in Afghanistan, but now it's shifting to South Asia. So the countries there would be Pakistan and so on. So the shifting landscape, this section here really focuses on that shift of terrorist activity being from the MENA region with core ISIL activity to now spreading to other parts in sub-Saharan Africa. To put this in perspective, this past decade had the highest deaths of terrorism on record. We see staggering increases in 3 regions, so the MENA region, South Asia, and sub-Saharan Africa. But if you look at those 3 regions and take it out of the equation and just looked at the rest of the world, we're seeing that deaths from terrorism is actually decreasing. So in the early 2000s, there was about 12,000. And now in the 2010s, about 10,000. And again, as I mentioned, the major driver of this increased activity was from ISIL activity. So focusing on ISIL activity and trying to make the distinctions between various actors, the color in this graph represents core ISIL, so the original group that concentrated its activity in Syria and Iraq. Then we see its provinces, so groups that formally pledged allegiance to ISIL, and then also affiliates who pledge allegiance to ISIL. This is something that we've seen in the West, groups or individuals that will have little to no contact with core ISIL, but will pledge allegiance to it before an attack. And so even though core ISIL has been militarily defeated, their efforts continue to spread across borders. So in 2019, ISIL, whether it be its provinces or affiliates, conducted attacks in 27 countries. The height of this activity was about in 2017, where ISIL attacks occurred in 35 countries. So in 2013 and 2014, proportionately, Most of ISIL activity was occurring in the MENA region, and then after that, moving towards the present, ISIL activity is split pretty evenly between the two other main regions, Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. So this report also takes a look at far-right terrorism and political violence in the West. In this report, we give a little bit more detailed explanation on what we mean when we say the West, but essentially that term includes countries such as the US, Canada, Western Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. So the report, one of the report's findings is that in the past 5 years, we've seen a 250% increase in far-right terrorist attacks. To put that into context, that started with a pretty low base. So if you're looking at the total number of attacks in the world, the number of far-right attacks is quite small. But if you're looking at just the West, far-right terrorist attacks outweigh all other forms of terrorism. So yeah, in the context of the West, far-right terrorism is definitely an emerging threat. In terms of defining far-right terrorism, there's a longer definition in the report, but we refer to it as a political ideology that is centered around one or more of the following elements. So strident nationalism, that's usually racial or exclusivist in some fashion, fascism, racism, anti-Semitism, anti-immigration, and themes that often contain populist elements. So the classifications we use for this are taken from the GTD. One thing that I'll note is that not every group or organization with these characteristics can be considered far-right, and then not every far-right group is automatically violent or terroristic. Something that we really focus on are the incidents. So getting into the characteristics of a group is kind of hard to quantify and measure in this sense. So that's why we really focus on the incidents and who claimed those incidents. So even though political terrorism isn't new, we can see that there's been an uptick of fatalities and incidents related to political terrorism in 2018. So now we're starting to see political terrorism as a larger threat in the West than religious terrorism. By 2019, far-right incidents have accounted for 46% of attacks in the West. So where do these incidents occur? A majority of them occur in the United States and then in Germany. If you look at deaths, the majority of them also occur in the US. Second would be Norway, and that is because of the 2011 attacks. So almost every country in the West has registered at least one far-right terrorism attack since 2002. So we looked a little bit at the characteristics of far-right terrorism. And one of the things that we found is that 60% of far-right attacks are carried out by individuals with no group affiliation. Same goes for Islamist attacks, specifically in the West. So when an individual carries out an attack, we would consider them unaffiliated because they're not necessarily tied to a group, but more so inspired by a specific ideology. That's not to say that far-right terrorists don't have contact with extremist organizations or that their radicalization occurs entirely in isolation. We know that contact with like-minded individuals is a step in the radicalization process, but our analysis has shown that when it comes to the incident or the attack, that plans to commit violence aren't usually shared with other individuals before the attack. So that's why also tracking their online activity, they're mostly considered unaffiliated. So focusing specifically on the relationship between mass shootings and terrorism in the United States, the proportion of mass shootings being classified as terrorist attacks are increasing, but that overall, from this chart, we can see that mass shootings in general have increased in the past 5 years. I think this piece of research also goes to show the changing landscape of how far-right terrorist attacks are categorized, classifying it as domestic terrorism as opposed to hate or gun crimes, or even charging it as both. So in addition to an increase in mass shootings, there's also been a change in how we categorize them. Talking more about systems and the socioeconomic factors that are correlated with these trends in terrorism. So looking at data from 2002 and looking at the most active terrorist group, by 2019, only about 20 of them are still active. We know that terrorist groups are extremely fluid. They start, they break off, they merge with others. And so that's the trend that we're also seeing in sub-Saharan Africa, especially with that shift of core ISIL activity moving into increased activity from its provinces and affiliates. So the last section of this report covers the analysis of the motivations of terrorist groups as well as its operational mechanisms. So we tried to simplify it in this chart, talking about 4 feedback loops. So recruitment, funding, media, and motivation. All of these feedback into their political and social influence, which you know is both an objective of the terrorist network and a piece of the larger puzzle that keeps said network operating. So when it comes to counterterrorism efforts, really this analysis is just meant to contribute to that larger conversation that in order to disrupt these groups, we have to map out and pinpoint where their support networks lie. And so very briefly on how the COVID pandemic has affected the relationship between terrorism and counterterrorism efforts. Something to look to in the 2021 Global Terrorism Index is whether or not terrorist organizations have taken advantage of a global shock such as the COVID-19 pandemic. The answer intuitively is probably yes, since more people are spending time online. So that gives opportunity for radicalization. Another aspect is that states that are already fragile would ultimately become more weak, especially since international aid would slow down and government funds would be diverted to propping up the economy. So I guess to just provide some closing thoughts, even prior to the pandemic, we've known that economic calamity, social polarization, and political uncertainty provide opportunities for violent extremists to push their agenda. So this is something that is ongoing in our research, and for so long as the pandemic plays out is something that we'll look to. So that's pretty much the end of the findings from the report. I know the report covers a wide breadth of aspects. It's about a 100-page report covering all those topics. So this was really just a snapshot of those findings. But I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so I can take some time to answer questions. Jordan, back to you.
All right, and before I can even get my camera back on, Moshe, it looks like you have a question. Go ahead.
Hi, great to meet you. Thank you so much for doing this really interesting stuff. I'm Moshe. I'm first year at in the Security Studies program, concentration in terrorism and substate violence. Something I was curious about was your distinction between the political and religious terrorism, especially in regards to how those things interplay, how you decide if something is religious or political. Something I think a lot about is like right-wing extremism and how that's related to Christian extremism, especially with attacks on abortion clinics in the United States and things like that. So how do you guys make those distinctions between what's like a political statement and what's a religious statement?
Yeah, so I would say in far right generally, I'll have to open it up, but essentially in the report, because it's so hard to define far right terrorism, right? We give kind of just a shorthand list of general like ideologies. So as I mentioned, nationalism, anti-feminism, anti-immigration, anti-Semitic, incel extremists. So far right as a whole, we'll take a look at that. We'll take a look at that more broadly. But within the GTD, actually the START database, they make that distinction between political and religious. And I think it depends on the target of the incident that it'll be It'll be categorized as political or religious, and also if there are any affiliates within that group. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. That was a really interesting question too. Does anybody else have something that they wanted to ask our speaker? You can either raise your hand or just unmute and jump in, or you can put something in the chat if you prefer. And Jessica, while we give folks a moment, one question for you is, I guess, how does this fit into the rest of the work that IEP does? I know you all produce a number of these kinds of reports.
That's a pretty good question. So IEP, if you're in the peace and security and conflict space, we're most known for producing the Global Peace Index, which measures essentially conflict globally. And so because we measure conflict, that's how the Global Terrorism Index came about, looking at terrorism as that specific conflict. The Global Terrorism Index is actually used as an indicator within the Global Peace Index. So really are different aspects of our research, terrorism. We also look at religion and peace, business and peace. Those kind of interconnect with one another. One of the aspects of our research that we're doing is how terrorism is related to ecological threats. So the way that the changing climate, the changing environment, especially in fragile states, how that's affected conflict. The trends that we're kind of seeing right now is increased food insecurity, increased water insecurity, also population growth. With particular to population growth, how will that affect trends in terrorism within the next decade, as this massive group of young people are starting to emerge within these states.
And do you have any initial either predictors or hypotheses on that you all are producing?
One thing that we've noted, so the country of Afghanistan ranks quite poorly in all of our indexes, so the Global Peace Index, the Global Terrorism Index, and now in our research with ecological threats, they are actually the most at risk to ecological collapse. So, looking at Afghanistan specifically would probably tell us a lot about that relationship between conflict, terrorism, and environmental change.
It's really interesting. Thank you. Any other, I'll give folks just another minute if anybody else has questions to pop in with. Go ahead, Rebecca.
Just keeping myself hidden. I'm a little disheveled this morning. Thank you so much for your talk. This was really interesting. I was particularly interested in, you kind of were just starting to get into it, in the economic impacts. And I apologize if I missed this, but so the report kind of concludes that Afghanistan had the biggest impact in terms of economic in relation to its GDP. But I'm wondering if you could specifically talk about how that's calculated, in the sense of Burkina Faso has seen this huge increase in terrorism, but its GDP is obviously extremely low. So like, is that, like, are you guys looking at the real GDP or the nominal GDP, or how do you compare that in terms of a country that's maybe GDP is so low that terrorism wouldn't necessarily show like a big spike, but is in fact greatly affecting its ability to build its economy?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'd have to double check if it's real or nominal GDP. But I mentioned in the presentation, it's kind of it's a very face value calculation, because really what we're looking at is property damage, deaths that the government has to incur when there are fatalities, and injuries. So those are the two big heavy hitters when it comes to how that affects Afghanistan's economy. I think it's like 17%. So 17% of its GDP, just looking at property damage, costs that incur by fatalities and injuries alone is quite significant. So because it's such a conservative model, I imagine that the effect is actually greater because we don't know how it would affect trade or international aid or even the way counterterrorism efforts move in and out of the country.
Great, thanks so much. Yeah, I think that really kind of highlights it, because especially if you're looking at like the government cost and like a housing or an infrastructure. So a place like Burkina Faso doesn't have much infrastructure or government cost per death. So its effect on GDP would be really low. And in fact, it's really devastating the community. That's super interesting though. Thank you so much.
Yeah, if I also might add, these are costs incurred just from the incident alone. So, you know, the incident could have so many ripple effects within the economy, within just the way the infrastructure works. And so calculating that is a little hard to keep track of because you don't know what those ripple effects could be.
Yeah, do you know of anyone or any other organization who's attempting to just track the like economic impact of terrorism? Like that, because you're right, it is such a huge, I don't even know how you'd begin to drill down, but I'm sure someone is. But if you, I'm putting you on the spot, but maybe I'll do my own research to kind of drill into that more.
Yeah, I'd have to probably check how the GTD also keeps track of their incidents and costs and see if any institution has taken up a specific aspect of that work and picked it up. The work that we do, it's mostly global, so we're limited by our global data sets. So I'd also be equally interested if anyone looks at it at a country or regional level.
Thanks so much.
I'll ask a follow-up if no one has any other questions. And I'm just really interested in the religious violence tracking, especially in the fact that we kind of lumped all the religious violence into like one group called religious violence. Do you guys make any distinctions or have any research on the difference between, let's say, like jihadist violence or Hindu extremism, or like any distinctions beyond the just like general term for religious violence?
I would say no, because I'll qualify, but yeah, we look at religious violence as a whole, but when it comes to identifying which religion, that's more of us just defining where they happen and who were the perpetrators. I think that there are a lot of other organizations that are better in kind of describing the ideologies behind them, but yeah.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you both for your questions as well. Any final thoughts on kind of how this fits into the broader picture of terrorism research? What are there interesting things that people are doing with this research that, you know, you publish these reports, and then how is it being used by governments anywhere? Anything like that? How does this fit into the bigger picture?
In terms of direct relationships, right now we have a strategic partnership with UNCTED. So they use our research quite a bit. I think just to just make the remarks on how trends in terrorism have been going. But yeah, I'd be quite interested and to see how people have used it. Previous master's students have reached out to me and have mentioned that they've used it in their work. We also present the research. So when this came out in November 20, we kind of did like a virtual circus tour of presenting our research, for lack of better words. So we presented to USAID, State Department, NYPD, since we're based here in New York. So yeah, just to give an idea of what trends are and if with these trends, if we can predict anything.
Great. And if anybody wanted to reach out with additional questions, either folks on the call or folks who watch this recording later, can they reach out to you?
Yes, I can put my email in the chat. So all of our reports are available for free online. If you're interested in the peace and security space, we also have like an online peace academy where you can take a look at more of our reports as well. The PowerPoint for this presentation is also available free and online. I can just drop the link in the chat when I go and grab it.
Wonderful. Rebecca, did you have another question? You're just turning on your camera.
Just came on, and if it was wrapping up, I would wave.
All right. Well, while Jessica finds that link, oh, there we go. Any final questions for her before we let everybody go off and finish their lunch hour? Or any final remarks from you, Jessica?
I just wanted to say thank you for hosting this space. It was really lovely chatting to all of you. Yeah, if you had any questions to reach out, I'd be happy to chat about it.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. And thank you especially, Jessica, for joining us today.
Thanks.
Take care, everyone.
Take care.